So nice to meet you.
Such a pleasure.
I know you're filming right now, and so it took some great effort to be here. But this matters very much to you, this theme of reconnecting with nature. You are Peruvian, indigenous, grew up in Australia, though.
Correct.
And have this wonderful view of both indigenous wisdom and technology, which I think combined might save us. I'm not sure, but what do you think?
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be interviewed by you, and it's such a pleasure to be here today. So I am Quechua from Peru. Most people know my people as the Incas, but that was the name we gave to our leaders. But if you've ever appreciated the beauty of Machu Picchu, that was my ancestors. And I titled my talk, now I forgot, but it's something about beauty, a blueprint for beauty, an indigenous perspective. Because having grown up in a family raised by my indigenous mother and grandmother and raised on the amazing feats that my ancestors accomplished with engineering, they were master astronomers, master agriculturalists, I was really given such a broad perspective on the history of this continent and what existed before 1491 so that I can judge what has followed with a bit of a broader perspective than most people, you know? And when you ask people the history of technology on this continent, their story would probably start in 1491 because they're not aware of the technologies that existed here beforehand. And why am I interested in technology? Because the other side of my family, my father and my brother, are computer scientists and coders and very much about data and algorithms. And so I've been able to really look at these two pathways that humanity has right now to choose from. This high-tech pathway, you know, which is like decarbonize, net zero, you know, high-tech will save us, green tech transition. And those words strike fear in the heart of my indigenous side because I know where the materials for this green tech transition are coming from. I know that they're going to use up extreme amounts of water in places where water is scarce, for lithium, for your electric batteries. I know where these precious minerals for the solar panels are coming from. And I know that indigenous people are terrified at the thought of taking this pathway that we think is going to save us. And as a storyteller, I'm here to propose an alternative and to illuminate a little bit about our history and indigenous history and our indigenous perspective on technology to offer people a fair choice. Which one do we want? And I would argue that one, the indigenous pathway offers us a pathway back into harmony with nature and a pathway that is more beautiful than the other. And when I say beauty, I want to define it in indigenous terms. When I say beauty, I don't mean Botox and filler and Vogue magazine. When I say beauty, I mean clean water. I mean abundant biodiversity. I mean reciprocal and right relationships within the web of life between humans and animals, humans and fungi and plants, water. And to us, that is beauty. And so I'm excited to get into this conversation with you and expand a little more about, you know, what I know about what existed here beforehand and how these are not concepts and images that have to live in the past, but we can bring into our future to create a more beautiful world for all.
Yeah. A little lifetime ago, I made a TV show called The Wonder List, where I got to go to the wonders of the world and wonder how'd they be changed by the time my daughter's my age in the year 2050. And we did an episode on Machu Picchu and the Inca Trail, and it was one of my favorites of all time. We went from Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, some of the origin myths there, followed it through Cusco, and to learn about this civilization that twice the size of California, that swept, I think, you know, a crazy number of latitudes, right? So they were able to engineer for deserts and mountains. They could grow dozens of different species of potatoes based on elevations. The architecture, stones 5 times bigger than the stones used at the pyramids of Giza that you can't put a credit card through, right? And just imagine if we had those engineers, if we could bring, time machine them into the present, what we could learn about living within the capacity of those ecosystems. And they might tell you, Well, you can't take water from the river if you're going to build a semiconductor plant over there. So you got to come up with a filter where you can just recycle your water and not take any from nature. So the indigenous principle sets the foundation that science has to then, technology has to fulfill within the boundaries. Does that make sense?
Yeah, wouldn't that be amazing?
Wouldn't that
if
be
science
amazing?
could be guided by indigenous principles, which are built on indigenous values. So why were we able to build such beautiful structures like Machu Picchu? Why were we master water engineers and able to, bring water like hundreds of kilometers to irrigate whole cities and towns? Because we lived in deep observation of the natural world and in deep intimacy with the natural world. So, fun fact, Machu Picchu and cities like Ollantaytambo were built on fault lines. Such genius. They were like, why should we spend so much human labor in breaking up these stones manually when we'll just build them where the tectonic plates will break them up for us? And sadly, no judgment or disrespect, but one of the saddest things about our history is when the European cultures arrived, they didn't recognize the value and the wisdom inherent in these cultures. And they set about extinguishing our languages, our food systems, and replacing them with monocultures, not just of food, which is in itself a terrible tragedy, but a monoculture of culture. Our languages were lost, and now we only speak English and Spanish, and Portuguese. Within our languages, we're embedded incredible technologies. For example, I usually wear my Kayapó earrings. These are not from that tribe, but the Kayapó are a tribe in Brazil that are credited, one of the tribes credited with building the Amazon. I mean, talk about tech and invention and where we need to invest. The Amazon is not just a pristine wilderness untouched by man. It is a bioengineered food forest and pharmacy that humans created over thousands of years. Actually, the soil of the Amazon is really not good for agriculture, not suitable for sustaining the millions of people that it's now proven were being fed and were being sustained in the Amazon. So what they did was they amended it with biochar, with compost over thousands of years, and they created what is known as terra preta, black earth, this fertile, rich, nutrient-dense soil in which they could plant the amazing biodiverse biome that we know is the Amazon today, that is responsible for precipitation, and the glaciers as well in the Andes are connected to what's going on in the Amazon. I mean, this is humans truly living in our design, which is to be a keystone species, which is to be a species that other species rely on, to be creators of biodiversity, co-collaborators with the creator. I don't say nature because that's also an imposed Western construct that we have somehow separate from nature. And in Quechua, we don't even have a word for nature because the concept that we are separate from it is actually quite foreign and ridiculous to us. So these are some of the technologies that I want to present today as alternatives to the high-tech solutions that I see as real band-aids. I think the crisis we are in now is not one of climate. The poor climate is being demonized. The climate is just reacting naturally to the destruction that the real culprit is wreaking on this earth. And that real culprit is not a person, but a system. And I think Shia, who sadly I missed her opening speech, but I think she alluded to it, that it is the global economic system that is the real cancer. And all these little solutions are like trying to put band-aids on a cancer patient. But we could just get to the heart of things and look at the value system from which this global economic system comes from. And if we just attuned it to indigenous principles and indigenous values, then we might get to some real deep healing.
You can applaud that. How do you hope to use your stories to change that mindset? Because you don't get elected to a board of directors or to public office for saying, you know what, why don't we just slow down, everybody? Instead of shopping this Amazon Prime Day, let's reconnect with our neighbors and re-gift something and maybe just take a walk. It seems so radical saying that out loud because the story of consumerism is so embedded, at least in the American story. Right. How do you hope to change that?
I think it's a problem of, we've been severed from our spirituality. And part of that is because of the phenomenon of colonization and the diaspora that I am a product of. I'm half Indigenous, half European. All of us, many of us here have been severed from our own Indigenous lands. Everyone here is Indigenous to some place. And most of us are no longer living on those lands. So we've been disconnected, not only from the ecological knowledge that our ancestors gained over thousands of years of experience of living in land-based cultures, in deep observation of the natural world, but also the spiritual severance that occurred when we left those lands. And so what do we do when we have this deep spiritual void? We consume. Right. And so that's why I want to inject some spirit into this conversation. And that's why I think beauty is a beautiful entry point into that. Because beauty goes beyond the left brain solutions, and it touches people in their core. Mm-hmm. When I landed here today and I was so excited. I've never been to this part of the world, and I couldn't wait to see the mountains and the blue skies and the forest, and all I saw was smoke. And I could see that it was ugly. And I think we can all agree that we don't want to live in a world that is ugly, and we can all understand what is beautiful and what is ugly. It's not beautiful that most of the wealth in this world has been accumulated in a small group of people, like the dams that I'm hearing about here that we're finally learning to release so that life can flow into the rivers again and the salmon come back. That wealth also needs to flow back into the ecosystem of the world so that life can thrive again. An example of beauty as well that I want to just share with you, and I have 3 minutes, so I'm going to devote it to the story that I really wanted to tell. Who here has been to Mexico City or knows what it looks like? Who here can imagine El Gran Tenochtitlan, which was Mexico City's predecessor? Okay, so El Gran Tenochtitlan was a city built in the middle of a lake. Now, this lake is one of the largest in Mesoamerica, and it's surrounded by a series of volcanoes that over millions of years, the sediment of these volcanoes gathered at the bottom of this lake. And when humans came, indigenous people came to live and thrive on this lake, they realized that the silt, the sediment at the bottom of this lake was extremely fertile. And they're like, how could we farm here? They created what is known as the chinampas, which is an indigenous technology of, we call them floating, like islands, like little fingers, like floating on lakes, but they were actually rooted into the ground with trees that they would plant, okay? And so they created this system of chinampas on which they would grow fruit and food and flowers. So it was like can you imagine a lake of floating gardens and food forests? No highways or roads. They were moving around in canoes. This was like an ancient Venice. And in the middle of that city was the El Gran Tenochtitlan. And when the Spanish arrived, when Hernán Cortés arrived for the first time, he couldn't believe the beauty and the marvelous technologies that the Mexica had created and lived in. At that time, European cities were in squalor. They hadn't figured out sewage systems yet. But the chinampas were their own bioremediation system. You could filter gray water and black water through the chinampas, and it would emerge as, it would end up fertilizing the gardens around them. So can you imagine how beautiful that would be, and compare that to the urban squalor that Mexico City is in today? I mean, this is a lake full of abundant fresh water. Mexico City is about to run out of fresh water right now.
And it started with the conquistadors who decided to dike and dam.
In the infinite wisdom.
It over.
Right.
Yet another example, the same thing happened in Lahaina, Maui, Hawaii, was the Venice of the South Pacific until colonial arrogance and greed just completely changed the ecosystem, which people are paying for to this day
right.
as a result.
And I don't want to demonize anybody, when I talk about this, I'm talking about half of my ancestry as well. And I also want to contextualize this, like this is not just some past fantasy that I'm bringing to you today. It is possible to resurrect these systems now.
Exactly. If we learn from those mistakes. And so I don't know that it's demonizing as much as, boy, if they could have done it differently, they might have, if they could have seen the results. If the Mars rover somehow stumbled into intelligent life up there and beamed it back, we wouldn't burn it down.
Right.
We would preserve it and treasure it and try to gather more. Mm-hmm. And so hopefully we've reached a storytelling pivot where that sort of idea permeates. And I really appreciate you doing your part on that. Great to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too.
All right.
Such a pleasure to be here.
Big
Thank
hand.
you.